I want to tell you about a woman named Dorothy who came to see me about 15 years ago. She wasn't my patient, her husband Walter was. And Dorothy sat across from me in my office that afternoon, with her hands folded in her lap, looking at me with this quiet desperation that I've never forgotten. She said, "Dr. Harrison, there's nothing wrong with Walter's memory. He can tell you what he had for breakfast. He remembers our anniversary. He knows all the grandchildren's birthdays. But something is wrong. He's just not Walter anymore." When I asked her to explain, she struggled to find the words. She told me Walter used to be the one who planned their Sunday drives. He'd wake up excited about where they'd go, what they'd see, which little diner they'd stop at for pie. Now he just sat in his recliner. He didn't suggest anything. He didn't start conversations. He wasn't sad exactly. He was just quiet. Still, like someone had dimmed a light inside him. Dorothy looked at me and said something I've carried with me ever since. She said, "Everyone keeps telling me he's fine because he remembers things. But I've been married to this man for 47 years, and I'm telling you, doctor, something is happening that nobody else can see." She was right. And what she was seeing, what she was sensing with the intuition that only comes from decades of truly knowing someone, was one of the earliest warning signs of cognitive change, a sign that had nothing to do with memory at all. I'm Dr. Michael Harrison. I spent 40 years treating patients in the hospital, and now I'm sharing what I wish I could tell every senior and every family who's watching someone they love and wondering if what they're seeing is just normal aging or something more. Before we dive in, I want to be clear. While I'm a physician sharing evidence-based information, this video is for educational purposes only. It's not a substitute for personalized medical advice from your own doctor, who knows your specific health history. Always consult with your healthcare provider before making any changes to your health regimen. That said, let's get into it. What I'm going to share with you today could genuinely change how you understand brain health. Because here's what I've learned in my 40 years of practice that most people never hear. Dementia almost never begins with forgetting. It begins with changes that look like personality, like mood, like energy, like motivation, changes that families notice but can't quite name, changes that everyone dismisses as just getting older. And here's why that matters so much. The earliest stages of cognitive stress are also the most responsive to support. That's not wishful thinking. That's what decades of research from the National Institutes of Health and major aging research centers consistently show. When we catch these changes early, before memory is affected, we have the widest window to help the brain stabilize, adapt, and maintain function. But here's the problem. Most families are watching for the wrong signs. They're waiting for someone to forget names, to get lost driving home, to repeat the same question 3 times in an hour. And by the time those memory symptoms appear, the brain has often been under strain for years, sometimes a decade or more. That's exactly what happened with Walter, and that's exactly what I want to help you understand today. I'm going to walk you through 5 warning signs that appear long before memory loss, 5 changes that families see every day but almost never connect to brain health, not because they don't care, but because no one ever taught them what to look for. And I want to emphasize something important before we begin. These signs are not a diagnosis. They're indicators of brain stress. And stress, when addressed early, can often be slowed, stabilized, and sometimes even partially reversed. So this isn't about fear. This is about awareness. This is about giving you the information you need to protect yourself and the people you love. Let's start with sign number 5, and I'm going to work my way down to the most important one, which might just change everything you thought you knew about how dementia begins. Sign number 5 is the one that Dorothy noticed in Walter. It's the one that families describe more than any other, usually without realizing what they're actually seeing. They call it a personality change. They say things like, "He's just quieter now," or "She's not as social as she used to be," or "He doesn't seem interested in things anymore." And because there's no memory problem, no confusion, no getting lost, families assume it must be mood, or stress, or just what happens when you get older. I understand how confusing this can be, and I want you to know that if you've noticed something like this in someone you love and brushed it off, you're not alone. That assumption is incredibly common because it makes logical sense. If someone remembers everything, how could anything be wrong with their brain? Here's what the medical research shows us. Dementia doesn't begin as a memory disease. It begins as a regulation disease. The parts of the brain responsible for motivation, emotional expression, and social engagement often start to lose efficiency years before the memory centers show any damage at all. There's a reason for this that becomes clear when you understand how the brain is organized. The hippocampus, which is the structure most associated with memory, is relatively protected in the early stages of cognitive decline, but the frontal lobes and the limbic system, which control motivation, emotional tone, and the desire to connect with others, are often affected much earlier. Brain imaging studies have shown this consistently. The areas responsible for emotional processing and social behavior can deteriorate years, sometimes many years, before memory function is impaired. So what does this look like in real life? It looks like someone who stops finishing sentences, someone who used to love telling stories but now sits quietly while others talk, someone who was always the planner in the family but now waits to be told what's happening, someone who isn't sad exactly but isn't quite there either. I had a patient I'll call Robert. Now, Robert was a retired engineer, sharp as they come, could still do complex calculations in his head. His wife Margaret brought him in because she was worried about what she called his spark. She said it was like someone had turned down the volume on his whole personality. Robert could remember everything: names, dates, details from 50 years ago. On a standard memory screening he scored perfectly. But Margaret knew something was different, and she was right. What Margaret was seeing wasn't a character flaw or a mood problem. It was Robert's brain conserving energy. You see, conversation requires enormous neural resources. It demands attention, emotional processing, memory retrieval, sensory integration, and social calibration, all happening simultaneously. When those systems are under strain, the brain often chooses to withdraw rather than struggle. That withdrawal isn't a choice in the way we normally think about choices. It's the brain protecting itself from overload. It's compensation. And when we understand it that way, everything changes. Because the question isn't why is someone becoming quieter, the question is what is their brain responding to, and when we ask that question early enough, we can often do something about it. Now let me share sign number 4, which often appears alongside that emotional withdrawal, but is usually attributed to something completely different. This is the sign that families describe as low energy, chronic fatigue, or just slowing down. And because we associate aging with reduced stamina, nobody questions it. We say things like, "Of course she's tired. She's 78, as if exhaustion is just the natural price of getting older. Here's what I tell my patients about this. The brain is the most energy-hungry organ in your entire body. It represents only about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes roughly 20% of all the energy you produce. 20%. That's extraordinary when you think about it. When energy production in the brain becomes inefficient, and this can happen for many reasons including inflammation, blood sugar instability, poor sleep, or reduced circulation, the brain starts to ration its resources. It begins to cut back on what it considers non-essential activities. And one of the first things it cuts back on is social engagement, because socially engaging with other people is one of the most metabolically expensive things the brain does. It requires memory, language, emotional processing, attention, sensory integration, and social reasoning, all firing together. So when someone says they just don't have the energy for people anymore, that statement deserves attention. It may reflect a brain that's conserving resources because it no longer has the metabolic reserve it once did. This is what I call cognitive fatigue, and it's different from physical tiredness. Someone might still be able to walk around the block or cook a meal, but mentally they feel drained by conversation, by decision-making, by anything that requires sustained focus. I remember a patient, let's call her Eleanor, who came to me because she said she felt foggy all the time. Not confused, just foggy. She told me she used to host book club meetings at her house. She loved those gatherings. But now, even thinking about having people over exhausted her before they even arrived. Eleanor's memory was fine. She could tell me the plot of the book they were reading in perfect detail, but the thought of sitting through 2 hours of discussion made her want to take a nap. What Eleanor was experiencing wasn't laziness or depression. It was her brain telling her that something was straining its energy systems. When we looked at her sleep patterns, her blood sugar stability, and her daily activity levels, we found multiple factors that were quietly exhausting her neural resources. And here's the part that brings me hope. When we addressed those underlying factors, Eleanor started feeling like herself again. Not overnight, but gradually. Within a few months, she hosted book club again. She told me it was the first time in a year she felt present for the whole conversation. That's what's possible when we listen to what the brain is telling us early. Now I want to pause here and remind you of something important. I'm not suggesting you change any medications or treatments without speaking to your prescribing physician. What I'm sharing today may inform a conversation with your doctor, but any changes should only be made under their guidance. Let me move to sign number 3, because this one often hides in plain sight. Families see it but rarely connect it to brain health because it seems purely physical. This sign shows up as unsteadiness, poor posture, slower movement, or a general sense that the body feels less coordinated than it used to, and most people assume this is just joints getting older or muscles getting weaker. They think it's a body problem, not a brain problem. But here's what the research shows us. The brain relies on constant feedback from the body to maintain balance, coordination, and spatial awareness. Every step you take, every time you shift your weight, every adjustment you make sends signals to your brain that keep neural circuits active and synchronized. When that feedback weakens, and this can happen from prolonged sitting, reduced physical activity, or changes in sensory processing, the brain becomes less efficient at coordinating movement and cognition together. Movement isn't just exercise. Movement is information for your brain. Each step, each adjustment, each change in position provides data that keeps brain circuits working properly. This is why prolonged sitting is so problematic for brain health. It's not just about your muscles or your joints. It's about reduced blood flow to the brain and diminished sensory input from the lower body. Over time, the brain receives fewer signals telling it where the body is in space, which weakens neural integration. Sleep plays a similar role that many people don't fully appreciate. During deep sleep, your brain clears metabolic waste, stabilizes memory pathways, and restores energy reserves. This cleanup process is absolutely essential. Without consistent restorative sleep, the brain can't maintain itself properly. The waste products that should be cleared away start to accumulate, creating low-grade stress that impairs function. And then there's blood sugar, which seems unrelated to brain health, but is actually fundamental. Your brain depends almost entirely on glucose for energy. When blood sugar spikes and crashes throughout the day, which happens with irregular eating patterns or diets high in refined carbohydrates, neurons are strained, communication pathways are impaired, and over time, this instability causes real damage to the brain's architecture. Here's what's important to understand. These three factors, sitting too much, poor sleep, and unstable blood sugar, might seem like separate lifestyle issues, but neurologically, they converge. All three reduce energy efficiency in the brain and increase inflammation. This explains why cognitive symptoms often appear alongside physical changes. The brain doesn't separate physical health from cognitive health. It experiences them as one integrated system. I had a patient, let's call him George, who came to see me because his wife was concerned about his balance. He'd had a few near falls, and she was worried. George's memory was perfectly intact. He passed every cognitive screening without any issues. But when I looked at the whole picture, I saw something different. George had developed the habit of sitting in his recliner most of the day. He wasn't sleeping well, waking up multiple times each night, and his eating patterns had become erratic, sometimes skipping meals entirely, then eating a large dinner late in the evening. None of these things seemed like brain problems, but together they were creating chronic strain on his neural systems. His balance issues weren't just about his legs, they were about his brain not receiving the consistent input it needed to coordinate properly. When we made changes to George's daily routine, focusing on regular movement breaks, improving his sleep hygiene, and stabilizing his eating patterns, his balance improved, but so did his energy, his mood, and his engagement with life. His wife told me it was like getting her husband back. That's the power of understanding that the brain and body are connected in ways we're only beginning to fully appreciate. This brings us to sign number 2, which often surprises families because it looks emotional rather than neurological, and once you recognize it, you may realize you've been seeing it for years without understanding what it meant. This sign shows up as increased irritability, impatience, unexpected emotional reactions, or sometimes the opposite, emotional flatness, where someone just doesn't seem to react the way they used to. Families often describe this by saying things like, "He's just more short-tempered now," or "She used to be so warm, but now she seems distant," or "He flies off the handle" at little things that never used to bother him. And because these seem like personality issues or stress responses, nobody thinks about the brain. They assume someone is just going through a difficult time, or that age has made them more set in their ways. Here's what I've learned in my 40 years of practice. Emotional regulation is one of the most energy-intensive processes the brain performs. It requires constant communication between the frontal lobes, which manage judgment and impulse control, and the deeper emotional centers of the brain. When cognitive systems are under strain, emotional control is often the first function to become inconsistent. The brain's ability to modulate reactions, to filter responses, to smooth out the rough edges of our immediate feelings, starts to weaken. So what looks like someone becoming difficult or moody may actually be a neurological signal. The brain is struggling to regulate responses efficiently. This must be incredibly frustrating for the person experiencing it, and I've seen that frustration many times. Many seniors feel embarrassed or confused by their own reactions. They snap at someone they love, and then feel terrible about it. They can't understand why they're reacting this way when they never used to. And here's where families sometimes unintentionally make things worse. When they respond to emotional volatility with correction or criticism, they're adding stress to a system that's already struggling. Emotional correction without understanding increases the burden on a brain that's barely managing. What families need to understand is that these emotional changes aren't character flaws. They're not someone being difficult on purpose. They're the brain signaling that something is straining its resources. Let me tell you about someone I'll call Patricia. Patricia had been one of the most patient, gentle people her family had ever known. She taught elementary school for 35 years, and everyone marveled at her endless calm. But after she retired, her daughter started noticing changes. Patricia would snap at her grandchildren for minor things. She'd get frustrated at the slightest inconvenience, and then she'd feel terrible about it, sometimes crying because she didn't understand what was happening to her. Patricia's memory was fine. She remembered everything, but something in her emotional system had changed. When we looked at Patricia's overall health picture, we found chronic inflammation, poor sleep quality, and vitamin deficiencies that had been developing over years. Her brain was under metabolic stress, and emotional regulation was the first system to show strain. The beautiful part of Patricia's story is what happened next. With patience from her family, some targeted lifestyle changes, and attention to the underlying factors that were stressing her brain, Patricia's emotional stability returned. It took time, but within several months, her family said she was more like herself again than she'd been in years. That transformation happened because we caught the signal early before memory was affected, while her brain still had the flexibility to respond to support. This brings us naturally to sign number one, the most important one, the one that families almost always notice last, and by the time it appears, the brain has often been under strain for a long time. Sign number one is the loss of initiative. This shows up as someone who stops starting things. They stop beginning conversations. They stop suggesting activities. They stop taking the lead in daily life. They might participate when prompted, but they rarely, almost never, initiate on their own. Families often interpret this as contentment. They say things like, "Oh, she's happy just sitting quietly," or "He doesn't need to be entertained. He's fine just resting." But neurologically, this loss of initiative is one of the most telling early indicators of cognitive strain, and it's profoundly different from genuine contentment. Initiative is driven by frontal brain networks responsible for motivation, planning, and goal-directed behavior. These networks require dopamine signaling to function properly. When dopamine pathways weaken, the spark that says begin starts to fade. The capacity to do things may still be present. The person can still participate in activities, still enjoy experiences when they happen, but the internal drive to make things happen disappears. I want to tell you about a man I'll call Henry. Henry had been a builder his whole life. He loved projects. He was always tinkering with something, fixing things around the house, planning his next improvement. After he turned 72, his wife noticed that he stopped starting projects. His tools sat in the garage untouched. He'd still help if she asked him to fix something, but he never looked for things to do anymore. Henry's wife told me, "The man who used to wake up excited about what he was going to build today, now wakes up and asks me what he should do." Henry's memory was perfect. He could tell you exactly how to build a deck, step by step. The knowledge was there, the ability was there, but the spark that drove him to begin was fading. When I first met Henry, his wife said something I'll never forget. She said, "I know this probably sounds silly, but I feel like I'm watching him slowly disappear. Not his mind, his drive, the thing that made him Henry." That wasn't silly at all. What she was seeing was exactly what we've been talking about. The brain under strain doesn't always lose information first. Sometimes it loses momentum. It loses the engine that propels us forward into life. Here's what I want you to understand about all 5 of these signs. They're not separate phenomena. They're interconnected expressions of the same underlying stress. Emotional withdrawal, chronic fatigue, physical coordination changes, emotional dysregulation, and loss of initiative all reflect a brain that's struggling to maintain its normal function. And none of them require memory loss to be present. Memory decline is often the final chapter, not the opening one. Now here's the part of this conversation that I hope will stay with you, because it's the part that offers real hope. In the early stages of cognitive stress, before memory networks are significantly damaged, the brain still retains remarkable plasticity. That means it can adapt, reroute, and recover function when the underlying strain is reduced. This isn't wishful thinking. This is what longitudinal studies from major research institutions consistently show. Early intervention genuinely changes the trajectory of cognitive aging. And when I say intervention, I don't mean aggressive treatment or complicated protocols. I mean removing the chronic stresses that quietly exhaust neural systems. Things like inflammation, unstable blood sugar, poor sleep, reduced circulation, and lack of meaningful engagement. When those pressures are reduced, the brain often regains efficiency. We see improvements in attention, emotional regulation, and initiative, well before memory changes would even be expected. The brain isn't broken, it's overloaded, and when overload is addressed, it responds. This is why I believe so strongly in the power of awareness, because awareness creates the opportunity to act while action can still make the biggest difference. Here's what I recommend for anyone who recognizes these patterns in themselves or someone they love. First, approach what you're seeing with curiosity, not panic. These signs are signals that deserve attention, but they're not a diagnosis. They're an invitation to look deeper, to get a proper evaluation that goes beyond simple memory screening and to consider what might be straining the brain. Second, focus on the fundamentals. The brain responds powerfully to consistent routines that support circulation, sleep rhythm, and metabolic stability. This means regular movement, even if it's gentle. This means protecting sleep as a non-negotiable priority. This means eating in patterns that keep blood sugar stable rather than spiking and crashing throughout the day. Third, reduce stressors wherever possible. The brain thrives on safety signals. When it feels supported rather than challenged, when daily life is predictable rather than chaotic, when emotional connections are nurturing rather than conflicted, the brain performs better. And fourth, seek meaningful engagement that matches current capacity. The goal isn't to push the brain harder. It's to give it the right kind of stimulation, activities that are engaging but not overwhelming, social connection that's supportive but not exhausting, mental activity that's interesting but not frustrating, support not pressure, invitation not demand. That's what the brain responds to best. I want to share one more story before I let you go, because I hope it will stay with you. Several years after I first saw Walter and Dorothy, they came back to see me together. Walter's decline had been real, but it had been remarkably slow. Much slower than anyone expected. Dorothy had taken everything we discussed to heart. She'd adjusted their daily routines, focused on his sleep, changed their eating patterns, and most importantly, she'd stopped trying to make Walter be who he used to be. Instead, she met him where he was. She invited his participation without demanding it. She created safety in their home. Walter never became the man who planned Sunday drives again, but he remained present. He remained connected. He remained himself in the ways that mattered most to Dorothy, for years longer than anyone would have predicted. Dorothy told me something that day that I've thought about many times since. She said, "You know, Dr. Harrison, I spent the first year after we talked being angry. Angry that no one told us earlier what to watch for. Angry that we lost time we could have had." Then she paused, and she smiled. But then I realized something. We still had time. And because we knew what was happening, we used that time differently. We made it count. That's what I want for you. Not fear, not urgency, but clarity. The clarity to see what's happening, to understand what it means, and to use the time you have in ways that protect what matters most. And remember, this information is meant to educate and empower you, not replace the advice of your personal physician. Take what you've learned today and have a conversation with your doctor about what's right for you. Let me leave you with 3 things I want you to remember. First, dementia rarely begins with forgetting. It begins with subtle changes in emotion, energy, coordination, and initiative that families often mistake for normal aging. Knowing this gives you the power to notice earlier than most people ever do. Second, early signs are not a verdict. They're signals. Signals that the brain is asking for support, not surrender. And when that support is given early, the brain can respond in remarkable ways. Third, awareness restores time, and time is the most powerful tool we have. If you found this helpful, if you learned something today that you can use, I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. I release new videos every week specifically designed to help you take control of your health and maintain your independence as you get older, and I promise to always give you the science without the hype. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you noticed any of these signs in yourself or someone you love? I personally read every comment, and I'd love to hear from you. If you know someone who might benefit from this information, a spouse, a parent, a friend, please share this video with them. You might be giving them information their doctor never had time to explain. Next week, I'm going to talk about something that affects nearly everyone over 60 but almost nobody understands correctly. It's a habit that millions of seniors do every day, thinking it's completely harmless, but it quietly works against brain health in ways that will surprise you. When I first learned about the research on this, it changed how I advised my patients entirely. Take care of yourself.